Good evening, fellow patriots and critics of the official narrative. This is the Propaganda Critic, and I'm coming to you on Wednesday, 18 October 2017. Today I'd like to discuss with you an article I found which presents a criticism of identity politics and postmodernism. One thing that's interesting about this article is that the criticism comes from the perspective of a Marxist. The article was published in the magazine International Socialism, Issue 2, page 62, entitled Mistaken Identity, or Can Identity Politics Liberate the Oppressed? By Sharon Smith. And this was in 1994 that this was published. So I only cover the first part of the article as it presents her critique, as the other half is her defense of Marxism, and I'm not particularly interested in that. If you'd like to read more and look more into what she has to say, I will leave a link below the video in the comments section. So let's jump right into it. In light of the failures of the class struggle paradigm to fundamentally transform society into the Marxist utopia that they had initially thought it would, the radical left has begun to drift in the direction of identity politics, in the hopes that perhaps it will usher in their post-industrial classless society. Sharon Smith, however, disagrees with the approach and makes some pretty good points about the issues inherent in identity politics, although I'm sure they're obvious to most of the listeners on here. In the 1960s, she explains, most student radicals did not regard the working class as even a political ally. Instead, they looked for alternatives to class struggle for social change. This is largely due to the inability of a class struggle paradigm to sufficiently motivate the masses to foment radical social reform, largely because people aren't starving to death. So, in a time of supposed prosperity, she says, moral complacency and political manipulation, a new left cannot rely on only aching stomachs to be the engine of social reform. The case for change, for alternatives that will involve uncomfortable personal efforts, she says, must be argued as never before. And the university is the relevant place for all of these activities. Well, what do you know? She wants universities to be centers of Marxist indoctrination. Who'd have saw that coming? Well, if you ask Dr. Jordan Peterson, I'm sure he can give you a breakdown of that. Even the radical feminist movement started to fracture and disintegrate in the early 70s. The author expounds on this. The concept of a unified revolutionary movement, she says, was thus replaced by one in which each oppressed group would form its own autonomous movement. This conception, movementism, was the precursor to identity politics. And she discusses Jeffrey Escoffier, who in 1985, he's a quote-unquote queer theorist. I guess that's like women's studies or feminist ballet classes. I don't know. Anyway, in 1985, Jeffrey Escoffier, the queer theorist, summarized the rise of identity politics as follows. The politics of identity must also be a politics of difference. The politics of difference affirms limited partial being. The author elaborates on this. For Escoffier, arriving at this conclusion involved a conscious repudiation of working class agency and an accompanying sense of demoralization at the flawed vision of socialism. I think this is a pretty important point, as the working class not having a sense of agency gives them the opportunity to blame oppressors and to identify themselves as the helpless oppressed. And the demoralization and the sense of incompleteness and quote-unquote partial being is another driver behind this fragmentation into separate movements of identity politics. And I also have observed, I was a sociology major for a while, I've observed that especially in the United States, there's a very strong push for consumption. And in this consumer culture, we are not humans, but commodities. And that creates a greater sense of alienation. So, according to the author, we are now in a period of decline and discouragement. We have no objective guarantee that the working class recognizes capitalism as the cause of the injustice and inequalities of American life. Obviously, because it isn't. The recent history of American working class, she says, clearly shows that it lacks the organizational and political capacity to struggle effectively for the fundamental transformation of society. Well, I don't know why she needs to transform society so much, but let's read on and find out. The dominance of identity politics is a guarantee against building a lasting movement, she says. Well, I agree with that. The tendency among groups organized around identity politics has been to grow, sometimes substantially for short periods of time, and then fairly rapidly to shrink to a much smaller core membership. And we've seen this a few times with, I don't know, the Occupy Wall Street movement wasn't really identity politics. Do you think Black Lives Matter is going to fade out anytime soon? I don't know. Intuitively, this makes sense that it's going to be a whole lot of steam put behind it and then it's going to burn out. And this gives me a sense of optimism that all of these fragmented, aggressive movements to create this change, they're just going to burn out. They're not sufficient to foment this kind of change, because we all know that trying to eliminate class is very dangerous and it's not going to work, as we've seen with Stalin, for example. So that's all I've got written here on my script. I have some more information here. I think the big thing is a reassurance for my listeners that identity politics and the rise of identity politics is fundamentally a sign that the socialist left is self-destructing. So, according to the author of this article, the post-Marxist argument exists at the height of abstractions, she says. As such, it only stands as a negation of Marxist theory. If class is not the key division within society, then historical materialism is wrong. If autonomous movements form the basis for struggle, then the working class cannot be the privileged agent for social change. If there is no connection between the spheres of economics and ideology, then the Marxist theory of base and superstructure is wrong. So, what I find interesting about this, some of this wording, historical materialism is wrong. So actually, to go a little bit earlier on in the article, she talks about the postmodernist view, and she talks about how, let's see here. There's a philosopher whose name is Louis Althusser, and he rejected the idea of a, quote, totality within society, rather seeing society as made up of many different structures, including political, economic, and ideological. Ultimately, economics plays a determining role, but for the most part, different structures develop independently from the rest. He also saw history as a, quote, process without a subject. In other words, the details of history are fluid and can be changed. And we see this with the taking down of statues and the censorship of speech and forcing children to be taught history in a certain way. It's all a form of controlling the narrative. You see this with the media and the attempts to censor the internet. So controlling the narrative and rewriting history are, peas and carrots. They're one and the same. So let me know your thoughts on this. I'm willing to go into a deeper analysis, but this is just a sort of introduction. And I'm still perusing, trying to figure out kind of what this whole identity politics thing is about. But I thought it was pretty interesting to see from the perspective of a Marxist what she thought on the matter, as I'm not a Marxist, but she does make some good points regarding the nature of identity politics and how it's fundamentally just the fragmentation and self-destruction of the socialist movement. So let me know your thoughts. I appreciate you watching the show. Please leave a comment, share, like, get the word out, tell your friends. I feel a sense that I'm improving my quality of videos, but I really want your feedback. So let me know, guys. Let me know what you think. If you like what you see, please donate, contribute, leave comments, provide suggestions. Thanks again for everything. And I want to make sure that we can get a real movement going to challenge these oppressive forces in our society. We need to really join together as people and challenge the establishment. So thanks again, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.